The penthouse air in Gangnam was thick with the scent of expensive oud, spilled champagne, and the kind of desperation that only money can buy. Jae-min Han sat on a velvet sofa that cost more than most people's homes, his head tilted back, watching the city lights flicker through the floor-to-ceiling glass. A woman, whose name he had already forgotten, traced the dark ink of a dragon curling around his forearm with manicured nails. She was whispering something about a villa in Jeju, her voice a practiced purr, designed to catch the interest of a man who owned the horizon. Jae-min felt nothing. He took a slow drag from a hand-rolled cigarette, the smoke curling around his sharp jawline. To the world, he was the Prince of Seoul, a man of lethal grace and insatiable appetites. His reputation was built on two things: his father's brutal legacy and his own penchant for taking whatever and whomever he desired. Tonight was no different. The music was a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated in his chest, and the room was filled with the elite, the beautiful, and the broken, all vying for a single glance from his cold, dark eyes. "You're quiet tonight, Jae-min," a man said, leaning against the mahogany bar. It was one of his lieutenants, a man who dealt in shadows as easily as Jae-min dealt in silence. "I'm bored, Minho," Jae-min replied, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. He didn't move his gaze from the window. "It's all the same faces, the same hungers, the same scripted smiles." He looked down at the woman beside him. She was stunning, a masterpiece of modern soul beauty, yet she felt like static to him. He had slept with idols, heiress, and the most sought-after women in the city, and each time, the result was a hollow ache that settled deeper into his bones. He was a man who had conquered every desire, only to find that possession was the quickest way to kill the thrill. He stood up abruptly, shaking off the woman's hand. The room went silent for a heartbeat, the atmosphere pivoting on his mood. He was the sun they all orbited, and when he went dark, the world felt cold. "The party's over," he announced, not loud, but with an authority that brooked no argument. As the crowd filtered out, leaving behind the wreckage of a night of excess, Jae-min walked to the balcony. The wind whipped his black silk shirt against his muscular frame, revealing the intricate tattoos that marked him as a man of the Han Syndicate. He looked out over his kingdom and felt like a ghost. He had everything, yet he was starving for something he couldn't name, a spark that didn't come from a bottle or a temporary bed. He didn't know then that the change was already at his door. He didn't know that tomorrow, the boredom would end, and the real hunt would begin. The morning light in the Han estate was clinical, cutting through the high-arched windows of the grand foyer like a blade. Jae-min stood at the top of the marble staircase, his silk robe hanging loosely off his shoulders, exposing the dark, jagged ink of a tiger that prowled across his collarbone. He was nursing a headache born of expensive whiskey and the crushing weight of another identical day. Below him, the household manager was lining up the new staff, their heads bowed in a practiced display of subservience that usually fed Jae-min's ego. Then, the heavy oak doors groaned open, and the gravity of the room shifted. Nia Tandy walked in, carrying a small, worn leather bag. She didn't scurry, and she didn't look down. Her skin was a deep, radiant bronze that seemed to drink in the morning sun, and her hair was styled in neat, intricate braids that crowned a head held remarkably high. As the manager began his frantic lecture on the rules of the house, the "do not speak unless spoken to," the "always avert your eyes," Nia simply adjusted the strap of her bag and looked around the room with a calm, analytical gaze. Jae-min leaned against the railing, waiting for the moment her eyes would find him. He knew the routine, the sudden intake of breath, the blush, the frantic lowering of the gaze. He was used to being the most dangerous and beautiful thing in any room. When Nia's eyes finally travelled up the staircase and met his, She didn't flinch. She didn't bow. She looked at him the way one looks at a particularly ornate piece of architecture. Interesting, perhaps, but entirely inanimate. Her gaze lingered on his tattoos for a fraction of a second, not with the usual lustful curiosity, but with a clinical observation, before moving back to the manager. "Understood," she said, her voice a rich, steady alto that cut through the manager's nervous twittering. "Where is the supply closet?" Jae-min felt a sudden, sharp jolt in his chest, a spark of electricity he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping into that low, predatory rumble that usually brought people to their knees. "You're late," he remarked, his eyes locked on her. Nia turned her head back toward him, unimpressed. She checked the silver watch on her wrist. "Actually, I am 3 minutes early. The gate security held me for a secondary scan." She didn't wait for his permission to look away. She simply turned back to the manager. "The closet?" Jae-min watched her walk away, her stride purposeful and graceful. She hadn't asked for his name. She hadn't sought his approval. For the first time in his life, Jae-min Han was invisible in his own home, and the silence she left behind was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The silence of the Han mansion had always been heavy, but now it felt charged, vibrating with a frequency Jae-min couldn't quite tune out. Over the following week, the Prince of Seoul became a ghost in his own hallways. He found himself cancelling meetings with the syndicate, ignoring the insistent pings of socialites on his phone, and lingering in rooms he usually bypassed. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was looking for a crack in the armor. He sat in the darkened library, a glass of amber liquid sweating in his hand, watching through the cracked door as Nia polished the floor-to-ceiling windows in the gallery. She moved with a rhythmic, meditative grace, her headphones on, lost in a world he wasn't invited to. There was no performative flattery in her movements, no lingering near his study hoping to be accidentally seen. To her, the glass was just glass, and he was just the man who lived behind it. Jae-min set his drink down, the clink of ice against crystal sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stepped out into the hall, purposefully crossing her path as she moved to the next pane. Any other woman would have gasped, dropped her cloth, or offered a flirtatious apology for being in his way. Nia simply paused. She pulled one earbud down, her dark eyes meeting his with a steady, unblinking clarity that made his pulse thrum against his ribs. She didn't move to clear a path. She waited for him to move. "The sun is hitting this side of the house," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that usually commanded total submission. "You'll leave streaks if you don't use the distilled solution." It was a lie, a pathetic attempt to assert dominance over her expertise, to prove he was the master of his domain. Nia looked at the window, then back at him. A small, almost imperceptible tilt of her head was the only sign she had heard him. "I already switched to the distilled mix 10 minutes ago, Mr. Han." The heat index changed. She didn't wait for his reaction. She replaced the earbud, turned her back to him, and resumed her work. The dismissal was absolute. Jae-min stood there, his shadow falling over her working form, feeling a surge of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite desire. It was a hunger for recognition. He realized, with a jarring sense of vertigo, that he didn't want her to fear him. He wanted her to see him, not as the boss, not as the monster, but as a man worthy of her attention. For the first time in his life, Jae-min Han didn't want to take. He wanted to earn. The dining room of the Han estate was a cavern of cold marble and suffocating tradition. At the head of the long obsidian table sat Hwan-Soo Han, a man whose presence felt like a tightening noose. He didn't eat so much as he dissected his meal, his movements precise and joyless. Across from him, Jaemin sat in a silence that felt heavier than usual, his fork tracing aimless patterns in a delicate reduction of wine and bone marrow. "The Elder Council is asking about the Busan expansion, Jaemin," Huan Su said, his voice a gravelly rasp that demanded absolute focus. "They say you've missed 3 briefings this week. They say the prince is preoccupied." Jaemin didn't look up. His mind was 3 rooms away, wondering if Nia had finished the library or if she was currently standing on the terrace, looking out at the city she seemed so spectacularly unimpressed by. "The logistics are handled, Father. I don't need to be in a room full of old men to ensure a shipment arrives." Huan Su set his silver knife down with a sharp clack that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. "The men follow a leader who is present, not a boy who drifts through his own halls like a shadow. You've been staring at that doorway for 10 minutes. Are you waiting for your dinner, or are you waiting for the help?" The air in the room curdled. Jaemin finally met his father's gaze, his eyes narrowing into flinty shards. The power struggle between them was an old dance, but tonight, the steps felt dangerous. "I'm waiting for the conversation to become interesting," Jaemin replied, his voice a low, lethal silk. Just then, Nia entered. She moved with a quiet efficiency, carrying a carafe of chilled water. She didn't falter as she approached the table, despite the predatory aura radiating from the older Han. As she leaned in to refill Hwansu's glass, the patriarch's eyes raked over her, not with desire, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man identifying a weed in his garden. Nia remained unfazed. She filled the glass to the perfect level, her hands steady, her expression a mask of professional indifference. As she turned to Jaemin, their eyes met for a heartbeat. There was no plea for help in her gaze, only a calm recognition of the tension. She poured his water, the sound of the liquid the only thing breaking the silence, and then she was gone, her footsteps receding into the hallway. Hwansu leaned back, his eyes fixed on his son's face, which had betrayed a split second of softening. "A beautiful distraction is still a distraction, Jaemin, and in this family, we remove anything that slows us down." Jaemin felt a cold, sharp spark of defiance ignite in his chest. "Some things are worth slowing down for, Father." The dinner continued in a silence that felt like a declaration of war. The cracks in the porcelain had appeared, and Jaemin realized that to keep Nia in his world, he would eventually have to burn his father's world to the ground. The rain in Seoul fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, blurring the city's neon skyline into a smear of bruised purples and electric blues. Jaemin stood on the covered balcony of the library, the cold air biting through his thin shirt, a contrast to the fire burning in his chest. He heard the soft, melodic hum of a song he didn't recognize before he saw her. Nia was there, gathering the stray cushions from the outdoor lounge, her movements unfazed by the storm. "It's a Kosa lullaby," she said, not looking up, sensing his gaze like a physical weight. "My mother sang it when the storms over Johannesburg got too loud." Jaemin didn't retreat. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until he could smell the faint, earthy scent of her skin beneath the sterile aroma of the mansion's cleaning supplies. "Johannesburg," he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "Is it as cold there as it is here?" Nia paused, a cushion cradled in her arms. She looked out at the rain, her expression softening into something Jaemin hadn't seen before, a genuine, aching nostalgia. "It's a different kind of cold, dry, but the light in South Africa is gold. Even the dust looks like treasure when the sun hits it. Here, everything is glass and grey." For the first time, Jaemin didn't try to impress her with his power or silence her with his status. He simply leaned against the stone pillar, his tattoos hidden in the shadows. I've spent my life in this grey, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I thought if I owned enough of it, I wouldn't feel the chill. Nia turned to him then, her dark eyes searching his face. She didn't see the Mafia boss or the heir to a bloody throne. She saw a man who had been raised in a cage made of diamonds. You can own the whole world, Jae-min, and still be a tenant in your own soul. The use of his name, stripped of titles and honorifics, hit him harder than any blow his father had ever dealt. It was an invitation, a bridge built of words and shared breath. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers, not to take, but to acknowledge the space between them. Tell me more, he said. And for once, he wasn't issuing a command. He was asking for a map to a place he had never been. Nia didn't pull away. She leaned back against the railing, the rain splashing against her heels, and began to talk of red earth and vast skies. As the night deepened, the Prince of Souls stood in the rain, finally learning that the most valuable thing he could ever possess was a story he hadn't bought. The air in the Han Estate's private lounge was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of a deal being brokered. Sato, a lieutenant from a rival Tokyo syndicate with a reputation for cruelty and a lack of restraint, lounged in a leather chair, his feet propped up on a glass table. Jae-min sat across from him, his expression a mask of bored indifference, though his pulse quickened when he heard the soft click of Nia's heels entering the room. She carried a tray of refreshments, her movements as fluid and dignified as ever. She didn't look at the men. She focused on her task, placing a crystal glass of whiskey near Sato's hand. Is this the new acquisition, Jae-min? Sato's voice was a jagged rasp. He didn't look at the drink. He looked at Nia, his eyes travelling over her with a slow, slimy entitlement that made the hair on the back of Jae-min's neck stand up. I heard you were keeping something exotic under your roof. She's certainly more striking than the usual girls. Jae-min's hand tightened around his own glass, the knuckles turning white. She is a member of my household staff, Sato, not a topic of negotiation. Sato laughed, a dry, mocking sound. As Nia turned to leave, he reached out, his thick fingers catching her wrist, pulling her back toward his chair. A maid? Waste of talent. Come here, sweetheart. Let's see if you're as soft as you look. Nia didn't scream. She didn't even struggle. She simply went still, her eyes meeting Jae-min's with a look of profound, quiet disappointment, not in herself, but in the world he inhabited. In that heartbeat, something in Jae-min snapped. It wasn't the calculated aggression of a Mafia boss. It was a raw, primal roar of the soul. Before Sato could even blink, Jae-min was across the table. He didn't use a weapon. He used his bare hands, fueled by a rage that felt ancient. He slammed Sato's head into the glass table, the surface shattering into 1,000 diamond-like shards. He didn't stop. He dragged the man to the floor, his fists falling with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Each blow was a silent scream for every time Nia had been looked at as an object, for every time he himself had treated the world like a playground. Don't ever touch her, Jae-min hissed, his voice sounding like something from the bottom of a grave. The guards rushed in, pulling a blood-slicked Jae-min away from a barely conscious Sato. Jae-min stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands trembling with a violence that felt foreign to him. He looked at Nia. She was standing by the door, her wrist reddened, her face unreadable. He saw his own reflection in her eyes, a monster, red-handed and feral. For the first time, Jae-min Han was afraid of himself. He had drawn a line in the sand with blood, and he realized there was no crossing back. The aftermath of the violence hung in the air like ozone before a storm. While Jae-min was forced into an emergency meeting to settle the blood debt with the Tokyo syndicate, Hwon Soo-han moved through the mansion with the predatory silence of a man who had spent decades pruning his life of weaknesses. He found Nia in the sun-drenched conservatory, her back to the door as she tended to the rare orchids that lined the glass walls. Hwon-soo did not announce himself. He simply stood there, a cold shadow against the vibrant green, until the weight of his presence forced her to turn. "You have caused a great deal of damage for someone who only cleans floors," Hwon-soo said, his voice as dry as parchment. He stepped forward, tossing a heavy cream-colored envelope onto a potting table. Inside was a cashier's check for a sum that could buy a small village in the hills of South Africa. "That is more than you would earn in 3 lifetimes of service. Take it. There is a car waiting at the service entrance to take you to the airport. No questions, no goodbyes." Nia looked at the envelope, then back at the man whose eyes were as lifeless as stones. She didn't reach for the money. She didn't even flinch at the underlying threat in his tone. "You think so little of your son," she said quietly, "that you believe his interest can be bought off like a bad debt." Hwon-soo's jaw tightened. "My son is a king in waiting. A king does not burn his kingdom down for a maid. If you stay, you are not his muse. You are his executioner. My men do not take kindly to a leader who loses his mind over a woman. If the money doesn't convince you, perhaps the reality of what happens to distractions in this city will." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I have buried many things to keep the Han name pure, Nia Tandy. Do not make yourself a memory." Nia stood her ground, the height difference between them seemingly vanishing as she squared her shoulders. "You aren't afraid that I'll ruin him, Mr. Han. You're afraid that I'll make him realize he doesn't need you." The slap was sudden and sharp, the sound echoing off the glass. Nia's head snapped to the side, a thin trail of blood blooming at the corner of her mouth. She didn't cry out. She slowly turned her face back to him, her eyes burning with a fire that no amount of money or violence could extinguish. "The car is waiting," Hwon-soo hissed, his hand trembling with a rage he rarely allowed to surface. Nia wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, her expression one of profound pity. She didn't pick up the check. She simply walked past him, leaving the patriarch standing alone among his expensive, suffocating flowers. The storm had passed, leaving the night air heavy and humid, thick with the scent of wet stone. Jae-min sat in his private quarters, the lights dimmed to a low amber glow that caught the jagged edges of the broken glass on his sideboard. He had spent the evening cleaning his own knuckles, the sting of the antiseptic a welcome distraction from the hollow roar in his head. A soft knock at the door preceded Nia. She didn't wait for an invitation. When she stepped into the light, Jae-min's breath hitched. The faint swelling on her lip and the reddened mark on her cheek were like brands against his soul. He was on his feet in a second, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the floor. "He touched you," Jae-min rasped, his voice vibrating with a lethal, suppressed energy. "My father." "He did more than touch me, Jae-min. He tried to buy me," Nia said, her voice steady, though her eyes held a depth of weariness that made him want to level the city. She walked toward him, stopping only when she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. "He thinks I'm a ghost that can be scared away, but I'm not the one who's afraid." Jae-min reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered near her bruised face, but she caught his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You want me," she whispered, the honesty of it stripping him bare. "You've watched me for weeks. You've fought for me. But you haven't lived for me. You're still his shadow." "I can protect you, Nia. I can give you anything. I don't want your protection. I want your truth, she interrupted. She moved closer, her body a soft pressure against his rigid frame, an intimacy he had sampled 1,000 times with others, but never felt like this. It wasn't a surrender, it was a challenge. I will stay. I will give you everything you've been watching for, but only if you say it. Only if you admit that the great Jae-min Han is terrified of the man down the hall. The silence between them stretched, taut as a wire. Jae-min looked into her eyes and saw the crossroads of his entire life. To touch her now, to take what she was offering, meant declaring war on the only world he knew. He felt the sweat on his palms, the frantic drumming of his heart, the physical manifestation of a fear he had buried under layers of ink and violence since he was a child. I am, he choked out, the words tasting like ash. I am terrified of losing everything I've built. I am terrified of him. Nia didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a slow, deliberate seal of fate. Good, she murmured against his mouth. Now we can finally begin. As he pulled her into him, the Prince of Soul felt the crown fall. He wasn't a boss, and he wasn't a son. He was just a man, finally choosing a side. The following evening, the Han Syndicate gathered in a subterranean vault beneath the city, a place where the air tasted of cold iron and old secrets. Hwan-Soo sat at the head of the stone table, the elder council flanking him like gargoyles. On the monitors lining the walls, a live feed showed Nia Tandy being escorted toward a windowless black sedan at the service entrance of the mansion. The girl is a liability, Jae-min, Hwan-Soo said, his voice echoing with the finality of a gavel. She knows the layout of this house. She knows your temperament. And more importantly, she is the reason the Tokyo deal is currently in tatters. Give the order to move her to the out-processing facility in Incheon. Prove you are a Han. The out-processing facility was a euphemism everyone in the room understood. It was a place people went when they were no longer convenient to the world. Jae-min stood at the edge of the table, his black suit tailored like armor, his face a mask of stone. His phone sat on the table between him and his father. One text message to the security team would seal Nia's fate and solidify his ascent to the throne. The elders watched him, their eyes hungry for a sign of the ruthlessness they required. Jae-min looked at the screen. He saw Nia pause by the car. Even surrounded by armed men, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen waiting for a lesser tribe to finish their posturing. He remembered the feel of her skin and the weight of his own confession from the night before. He picked up the phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. Do it, Hwan-Soo commanded, his eyes narrowing. End the distraction. Become the boss. Jae-min's thumb moved, but not to the command app. He dialed a direct line. Code red, he said into the receiver, his voice steady and cold. Extract the asset. Eliminate any resistance from the secondary team. Take her to the safe house in the mountains. If anyone follows, fire at will. The room went deathly silent. Hwan-Soo stood up, the chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. You just signed your own death warrant, Jae-min. You are betraying the family for a servant.
I'm not betraying the family, Jae-min said, turning to face his father, his eyes burning with the clarity that silenced the room. I'm ending the cycle. You call her a servant, but she's the only person in this city who isn't a slave to you. From this moment on, the Han Syndicate doesn't have a prince. It has an enemy. He turned and walked toward the exit. The guards at the door hesitated, caught between the old king and the new monster.
Jamin didn't slow down. He walked through them as if they were ghosts, the ink on his skin feeling like a suit of armor. He had lost his legacy, his wealth, and his safety in a single sentence. And for the first time in 28 years, he felt like he could finally breathe. The mountain safe house was a glass-walled sanctuary perched on the edge of a precipice, a final fortress between Jamin and the world he had just set ablaze. Outside, the headlights of his father's convoy cut through the mist, a slow-moving serpent of steel winding up the narrow road. Inside, the air was still. Nia stood by the hearth, the orange glow of the fire dancing in her eyes, her presence the only thing tethering Jamin to the earth. He placed his gun on the table, followed by his heavy signet ring, the gold band that carried the crest of the Han Syndicate. It hit the wood with a dull, final thud. "They're here," he said, his voice stripped of its usual razor-edged authority. He looked at his hands, the tattoos on his knuckles a map of a life he no longer recognized. "I've given up the throne, Nia. I've burned the bridges. There is nothing left but the man you saw in the dark." The door forced open, and Huan Su stepped in alone, his face a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He looked at the ring on the table, and then at his son. "You think it's that easy? To just walk away? You are a Han. You belong to the blood." "The blood is poisoned, father," Jamin replied, stepping in front of Nia, not as a shield, but as an equal. "I spent my life sleeping with everyone just to feel a pulse. I lived in excess because I was starving. But Nia didn't give me a kingdom. She gave me a mirror." Huan Su looked at Nia, his eyes flickering with a momentary, desperate realization that he had lost. "She is a maid from a world you don't understand. She will leave you when the money runs out." Nia stepped forward then, her hand resting firmly on Jamin's shoulder. The touch was grounding, a silent oath. "I've lived with nothing and felt like a queen," she said, her voice echoing with a strength that made the old man flinch. "Jamin lived with everything and felt like a ghost. You didn't lose a son today, Mr. Han. You lost a prisoner." Jamin didn't wait for his father's permission to leave. He didn't look back at the ring, or the monitors, or the legacy of violence. He took Nia's hand, their fingers interlocking, the dark ink of his past meeting the steady warmth of her future. As they walked past Huan Su and out into the cold mountain air, the convoy of men stood down. They saw not a boss retreating, but a man finally claiming his own life. The golden sun was gone. In his place was someone who had waited a lifetime for a woman who didn't want his power, but his soul. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the mist into the gold Nia had described. For the first time, Jamin didn't see gray. He saw the light.
Thank you for watching, but before you go, please like, share and comment. Mafia Shadowed Hearts.